Hello, everybody. It's a real pleasure to see you all here today. Very warm welcome to Chatham House. Thank you for braving the cold and the dark and for missing the England-Wales game by being here. My name is Henry Throp. I'm a research analyst at the Chatham House Sustainability Accelerator. And it's my job here tonight just to welcome you, make sure you're happy, and introduce the fantastic speeches we're going to get from the finalists as well. So, 100 years ago, in this spot, or in this spot generally, there was a counterculture going on, known as the Bright Young Things. This ragtag band of socialites, who were quite notorious in the tabloid press, would get up to various antics in this area. So I think tonight is a real effort to try and reposition the reputation of this area by a whole new generation of bright young things in a better way. But at the same time as those initial bright young things 100 years ago in 1920 were causing havoc around this area, another institution was born, and that is Chatham House. So we were founded in 1920 after the Paris Peace Agreement in a world that was trying to reinvent itself after World War I. In the last 100 years, and in 2020 we celebrated our centenary, and it was a time to reflect on what we think we have tried to achieve and what we want to achieve in the second century. And these are reflected in our second century goals and our missions. And that's for a sustainable and equitable growth, peaceful and thriving societies, accountable and inclusive governance. When you walked into the building this evening, you might have seen up on the walls there's various quotes which the interior designers of Chatham House helpfully put up for anyone who was trying to write a speech and needed some inspiration by walking around. One of them particularly comes to mind. Ideas do not travel as quickly as bullets, but they have a greater power of penetration. That was by Lionel Curtis in Chatham House in 1948. And it's with that in mind that I want to welcome you here tonight to listen to these fantastic speeches. I think there's no such thing as a free lunch, so I do have one challenge for you this evening, which is channeling that ideas have more penetration power than bullets. We can have all the ideas we like in this room, but what we've got to do is keep the conversation going. So anything you hear tonight, ideas you hear, don't leave them in the room, take them with you, discuss and talk about at university, at work, with friends, with colleagues. This is Chatham House in a nutshell. When you walk into this room, I think you're crossing the threshold into a place of ideas. But I don't just work at Chatham House, I work at the Chatham House Sustainability Accelerator, which is a team within Chatham House. We were initially founded in 2020, 2 years ago. And I think what drives us as a team, Anna on the judging panel and Nina, who you met on the door upstairs, is we're not just interested in the ideas, we're interested in your heart, in coming to these events as a whole person. And so what we're interested in is the space between ideas. We're not looking at how to change the finance sector or how to change the security system. We're looking at the space between ideas and the people who operate between these ideas. And that's why we were so excited when Richard spoke to us tonight about this idea of looking at environment and security together, because it's in those bridging of ideas that real change can be made. So when I was writing the speech, I came up with maybe 3 rules, like Fight Club, but better, one better, to which Anna, my boss, hasn't heard, but I will see how it sits. So what you've got to do, come here with brains, mandatory, Monday to Friday, maybe Friday afternoon off. Come here with heart, mandatory, even on a Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. And when you join, as I said before, when you join the Sustainability Accelerator in Chatham House, we want you to bring both your brain and your heart as a whole person. But it's also my responsibility to make sure you leave here as a whole person. So if the fire alarm goes off, we're not expecting that to happen, so coolly and calmly follow us out the fire exit over there. We're not expecting that to happen. So we have a few more quick rules. So tonight, the event will be on the record, so not under Chatham House rule. I had to say that when I'm on the stage. And I will quickly now hand over to Richard Milburn from King's College London, who will give an overview of why we're here tonight and how we came here tonight. And then Richard will give to Anna, who will talk a bit about what the judges will be, what criteria they will be using and how they will judge the competition tonight. But it's a real pleasure to be with you, and thank you for coming.
Yeah, thanks, Henry, and thanks to Chatham House for hosting this, and also to our judges for coming up. A very prestigious panel. So, yeah, to provide a bit of overview, initially, me and Anna were on a panel together and then sort of talking about this Sustainability Accelerator and what could we get going as a pilot project, trying to take some of that sort of VC mindset of how do you spark innovation and push it through. And also, particularly in this space where there's so much information and there's so much complexity, how do you get new thinking quickly across to policymakers? So the idea was therefore formed, instead of asking for an essay competition or a blog competition, actually to look at a slide deck and a pitch competition. So crucial skills for the work environment to be able to pitch and also to communicate visually rather than just using words. So we talked a little bit about what the question could be. It was going to be focused on Ukraine, and then we actually thought it's much better to give people the space to think more broadly. So the topic was then what's going to be the biggest environmental security issue within the next 5 years. So really forcing people to say, okay, not just what are the issues, how do you make the case for something being super, super important, and also how do you interpret that question? And we've got some really, really good examples of that from our speakers tonight. We had the semi-final at King's, so students had to submit a 5-slide slide deck, so as visual as possible, sort of bare minimum words and so on. That was then the initial sift. We then had a semi-final. We had 15 people pitch at King's to myself and a colleague, and then that narrowed down to the 7 you hear tonight. So you'll hear about the judging criteria, but it was really not just necessarily what's the biggest issue, but how do we interpret that question in an interesting way? How do you get the biggest bang for your buck? What's the change or the thing that's not being looked at that could actually be really quite revolutionary? And also within that 5-year framework, climate change and so on, there's a lot of talk about 2050, 2100. But actually, what's the real urgency? What are those things that we need to do? So all part of, obviously the work the Chatham House Sustainability Accelerator is doing, and then also what we're trying to do at King's to push environmental security, to push the importance of environmental security, and also to really frame it as an important current issue that's been overlooked for too long. So hopefully all these sorts of competitions and campaigns and so on are really useful. And we're also looking at how we can use the structure, the notion of a 5 or 3 slide deck, as a really quick way to get information to policymakers. So a whole sort of ream of things that it fits into. And hopefully tonight will be a great session. As I say, some really fantastic speakers. So thanks once again for turning up as well for the audience. As we're missing the football, so that's a really big one, and shows obviously the environment is so important, right? If people are willing to sacrifice football, perhaps. So I'll hand over to Anna for a bit more detail on actually how tonight will go.
Thank you, Richard. I'm going to be very, very short. So just for clarity for all the people who are attending and watching this pitch, is each finalist will have 5 minutes to present their 5-slide. They must complete their pitch in no less than 4 minutes and 30 seconds and no more than 5 minutes and 30 seconds. So timekeeping is important. We will provide a score of 1 to 10 in the 5 criteria. So 5 criteria are relevance, novelty, quality of presentation, timekeeping, and effective and concise response to a question. So after the participants have done their pitch, we will here negotiate who will get to ask one question, and then the participants will then have 2 minutes to reply. And then in the end, we will then have a little huddle to pick one winner. I think that's it. And so with that, and then I'll read out probably, we have 7 presenters today. We have Holly Barsham, Julian Egan, Min Young Lee, Jake Hall, Matira Wheeler, Dan Burge, I hope that pronounced, and Clara Mikola. So with that, I might hand over to Holly. Yeah? Round of applause to Holly.
This slides are already here?
Yeah, yeah, there you are.
Okay, perfect. Ready? Thank you. So what I'm going to talk about today is permafrost, or more specifically, permafrost thaw. So the essentials are that ground that has been frozen for thousands of years is thawing. The impacts are that methane and carbon dioxide are being released into the atmosphere, intensifying global warming. New, or rather old diseases are being unearthed, and livelihoods are being destroyed. So while I don't have much time to talk about the solutions, what we really need to do urgently is more research, more collaboration, and more support for the communities affected. So permafrost is essentially made out of soil, rocks, and sand that are held together by ice. While ground that's frozen for at least 2 years is classified as permafrost, much of the permafrost has been frozen for thousands of years. So scientists have found microbes that are around 400,000 years old. It covers around 1/4 of the northern hemisphere, around 23 million kilometers squared. And 4 million people live currently permanently on permafrost in the Arctic, and 35 million people live on and around permafrost globally. So permafrost is currently, what permafrost looked like is currently changing. And much of these effects has been caused by global warming. So global warming doesn't look the same in the Arctic that it looks everywhere else. So a 2-degree increase on a global scale is more like a 3 to 4 degree increase in the Arctic. And a 2-degree increase would result in the eventual loss of around 40% of the world's permafrost. So permafrost is also harmed directly from industrial activity, including oil drilling, construction of roads and houses. So 45% of oil and gas fields in the Russian Arctic are in the most ecologically sensitive areas. And what's noting is that Russia is actually standing to benefit from the Arctic heating up, as large swathes of the country are becoming more accessible. So Russia, China, and other nations are already in talks to develop Arctic shipping routes around key areas, which could accelerate the ongoing environmental crisis. So while permafrost is not all going to melt soon, there is so much about it that we just don't know. So it's estimated that almost 1/3 of Arctic research has been conducted within 50 kilometers of just 2 sites, which is like trying to understand global politics by studying just Spain and Portugal. And our climate models just are not sophisticated enough to explain how and what changes are and are going to happen. So why do we need to worry? So permafrost presents several layers of threats. When it thaws, the organic carbon material previously frozen is decomposed by the microbes in the soil, releasing gases like carbon dioxide and methane. This causes global warming and in turn causes permafrost to melt even more. And as we all know, there are many terrifying consequences of global warming, including the increasing frequency of extreme climatic events, such as the 2022 Pakistani floods in the photo. Moreover, permafrost thaw could start to have the same carbon footprint as an emitter like China. This means that even if we in the UK put all of our efforts into becoming net neutral, and we let permafrost thaw get out of control, all of these efforts would be void. So while the 2015 IPCC report did consider the impact of permafrost thaw, newer studies have shown that we would need to overshoot the 2050 goal of carbon net neutrality by 8 years in order to cap global warming at 1.5 degrees. Secondly, and equally terrifying, is that the fact that permafrost could release so-called zombie viruses. Because permafrost acts as a freezer for our biological record, deadly diseases that have previously plagued human history, like smallpox and the bubonic plague, could be locked away. So this has actually already happened. In 2016, with an anthrax breakout in Siberia, was originated from a reindeer carcass that died over 75 years before. Finally, as permafrost thaws, it becomes slurry-like, damaging the foundations of houses built on it. It can also cause landslides and damage critical infrastructure such as oil and water pipelines, making the life of communities impossible and also increasing the potential for other environmental crises. Ladies and gentlemen, the message I want to leave you with today is that permafrost thaw presents an invisible threat. And this is because it's an irreversible process happening in the part of the world that we know the least about. And if we don't do more to understand how and what is happening, not only do we set ourselves up for inevitable failure in the fight against climate change, we could face a whole range of deadly and terrifying threats along the way. Thank you.
question. Does anybody want to?
On that slide, it says it's an irreversible process. That suggests that we've already passed a tipping point in the melting of the permafrost. Is that what you meant, or are you saying that once it starts, we won't be able to stop it?
So it's an irreversible process in that once permafrost has thawed, it's impossible to refreeze that ground. So that carbon that has come out and the impacts that it already had, those impacts are going to stay with us. Which means that, in a sense, because the Arctic is heating, the ground that is already thawing is causing other parts of the ground to heat up. And this process of the Arctic heating up and the ground thawing is impossible to reverse. So we can't put the ground back in a freezer, eventually.
Yeah. Right. Thank you. Thank you, Holly. All right. Next, we have Julian.
Great. Thank you. So despite the lackluster performance at COP27 the other week, the energy transition bull is well and truly out of the gate. And this is only being supercharged by what's going on in Europe and Ukraine at the moment. One Oxford study is suggesting that we may be able to get to fossil fuel-free status as early as 2050. And that's how we manage this particular transition is going to strongly influence local, regional and international security. But there are multiple threats that flow from this energy transition. And you can see I've listed them up there, and I'll work through them in the presentation this evening. I guess the bottom line up front for this particular presentation is that policymakers have largely been focused on emissions reduction and mitigation. They have not been consistently featuring this threat group in either assessments or strategies in a consistent manner. And so to give you a bit of a flavour, the US National Intelligence Assessment in 2021 had a tiny little box on petrostates, and it said, Saudi Arabia likely to get much hotter. With reduced oil income, it will therefore struggle to pay for all of the infrastructure to adapt. And it left me thinking, I think there's more to this story, and I think anyone who has even a veneer of understanding of the region knows that there is definitely more to that story. Which brings me to the first point, petrostates. If you look at Saudi Arabia, for decades they have based their internal stability on subsidies derived from their oil income. That said, as the transition progresses, they're probably likely to benefit for longer. They're a much more efficient producer. It's going to be your countries like Nigeria who get hit hardest and get hit first. I think COVID gave us a bit of a glimpse into Nigeria's potential future when the oil price dropped off a cliff and they had to borrow massively in order to cover their 80% odd of national income that comes from oil. Potentially Sudan gives us a bit of an idea of what happens as well when oil revenues dry up. It lost all of its resources to the secession of South Sudan, and you could argue that the regime change we've seen there has been partly due to that. Another key issue, energy independence. I think the West will probably go up. Other regions, it's less certain as to whether they'll become more independent or not. One of the principal questions is who will fund it and whose technology will actually be used. I think President Xi's answer to that question is, of course, China. If you look at their 5-year renewable energy plan, it says specifically that they will pivot towards increased clean energy in terms of the support it's providing to developing countries. And then there's also a potential risk, which again is highlighted within the 5-year plan, and that's this interconnection in terms of energy transition. Now, President Xi has this grand plan called the global energy integration. It's a huge undertaking, starting out in the region and then in theory going global. And I think we can see from today's world the challenges associated with reliance on any one state for energy. The final point there, I think states like the US and others are much more cognizant of this in terms of supply chains, batteries and so on. China, a major producer, they're getting there, but it's the other areas which are really overlooked. Then we've also got this concept of maladaptation. So for decades, we've seen countless examples of infrastructure projects that have been feeding into local conflict dynamics that have exacerbated or created new conflicts as well. That's now happening in the renewables sector. We're seeing it with solar in Kenya and Morocco. We're seeing it with hydro in Myanmar. There's also the prospect of potential interstate conflict as well. I've listed off a few examples there. The other issue that's sort of on the horizon is the creation of perverse incentives. Oil prices go down, consumption could potentially go up in some developing states. But I think the really interesting and perhaps concerning issue here is the potential for the export of nuclear technology. Again, it actually features in China's 5-year plan, but it also is on Russia's radar as well. This has issues around proliferation, around basic safety, if you're exporting it to areas with a lot of natural disasters like the Indo-Pacific, and also lock states into long-term relationships, geopolitical relationships, given the fuel and also maintenance requirements of that technology. The final threat relates to green minerals, so those things that are needed to drive the green energy transition. And it is interesting to look at who will essentially be the new Gulf states, the producers. A lot of them are developing countries, some of them are fragile countries, and that really comes with three key issues. 5-minute warning. Okay. One is the resource curse. The next one is increased localised conflict, with DRC being the poster child for that, and then also the geopolitical dimension, those Arctic resources, deep seabed mining, and interestingly, rare earth minerals in Donbass. So to conclude, well, first of all, I guess you know Russia is serious about its territorial claims when it starts putting it on postage stamps. But to conclude, the bottom line is really that it's a critical issue. It needs to be integrated into our assessments and strategies if we are to have a truly joined up and less fragmented approach that also addresses some of the gaps that are in this policy space at the moment. And I think it needs to happen now.
Thank you. So, Julian, you went a little bit over time, and just I think maybe I should hold the 5-minute thing so that you could have seen it. But yeah, question, Arminda, please.
Thanks very much. That was really interesting. So I think you've set out the problem really, really well, and now I want to push you a little bit further on kind of mitigation and what we do about this. So when you talk about on that last slide about the opt-in coalitions, what does that look like in an increasingly geo-competitive and geostrategic world where we're seeing a rise of great power competition, and that's only going to increase over the next 5 years?
Yeah, so when I say opt-in, because of the the geopolitical nature of some of these issues, I think it will need to be a group of states that are committed to sort of driving the policy agenda in those particular areas. So, say energy independence, for example, we've got the US has a plan, the EU has a plan. Australia, when it gets its act together, will probably be in the mix as well in terms of the Indo-Pacific. But there's no joined-up approach to that particular issue at the moment. So that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about opt-in coalitions.
Thanks.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks.
Next up, we have Ming Young Lee. Thank you.
If given the question which industry has been highly invested in recent years, I would say it's the electric vehicle, in short, the EV industry. This is because there's a great emphasis in reducing carbon emissions globally, and to meet this target, people are encouraging others to switch into electric vehicles. Electric vehicles are largely run by lithium-ion batteries, and as the name suggests, lithium is the crucial element for creating these batteries. And from the graph here, you can see that there's a huge spike in demand and price of lithium in recent years. Bloomberg stated that in just 2 years, the price of lithium went up to 1,300%. And World Bank forecasted that in upcoming years, there'll be a 500% increase in lithium production and will likely lead to a supply deficit in upcoming years. Then what are the problems for this? The first problem is access. Lithium reserves are located in very certain areas in this planet, and 58% of lithium is located in the lithium triangle, consisting countries such as Argentina, Bolivia, and Chile. And I predict that there will be an increased competition between great powers to gain access to lithium. Number 2 is independency. Currently, big powers are not seeking cooperation, but they are seeking self-sufficiency. One of the reasons why is China dominates almost 80% of the lithium-ion battery production and also has the largest amount of government investment in lithium mines abroad. So rather than cooperating with China, countries chose the way to be self-sufficient and be less dependent on them. Number 3 is environment. So lithium is highly invested because it is seen as a source of clean energy. However, there's an environmental dilemma because lithium mining and extraction processes is actually severely damaging the environment. Then why is lithium the biggest issue? And I would argue that to be a biggest issue in the upcoming 5 years, there should be some kind of hint in modern day. And I believe this hint is the increased investment. Before, the investment on lithium was mainly on the private level from private companies, but now we see a switch into a national level demand and investment on lithium. This is because lithium is critical for green energy transition. It is the main source, and it will remain as the main source for batteries in the near future, and there's no other elements to replace it. Also, electrifying vehicles with batteries are crucial for meeting carbon emissions, and this is not going to change in the near future, and hopefully reduce our reliance on oil. Also, it is a big issue because, as mentioned previously, countries are going to compete for lithium, and experts forecast that it will possibly lead to conflicts similar to those over oil. Especially, I'll focus on the escalation of tensions between America and China. So America recently has stated that gaining access to lithium is a source of national security, which is a pretty big word to gloss over for lithium. And this is because, however, this also shows their commitment and emphasis on lithium. Last month, they passed a law, and this would increase the investment in the EV industry in America. Also, the issue of Tibet will rise again because China is exploiting the Qinghai-Tibet plateau to gain access to lithium. And I believe that America is highly likely going to link the lithium crisis with the Tibetan crisis that's happening currently because Tibet has a lot of violation of human rights and other issues, and this would increase the scale of conflict as a whole. Finally, I suggest 4 possible solutions to prevent this crisis. The first solution is to reduce the price of lithium, and to do so, government should offer incentives to reduce the prices. Number 2 is cooperation. I believe that there should be talks specifically revolving about lithium because there's no measurements in place, and this would prevent the crisis from getting bigger. And number 3 is to diffuse the investment. Investment so far is only solely focused on lithium, and there are other elements that creates the EV batteries. And I believe that investment should be diffused in other minerals also. And finally, greater research and development to search for sustainable methods of lithium mining should be taken place. In conclusion, I believe that the lithium crisis is going to be the biggest environmental security issue in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. That was 5 minutes and 5 seconds. Question, Maddie?
That was fantastic. Thank you very much. I love that you present the solutions, because clearly that was going to be our question, but how do we educate the world on this problem and actually get the mindset changed that we're facing probably something similar to what we're facing now with fossil fuel, potentially lithium in the future?
I think the main reason why it's not widely known is because the media has not emphasized it as much. And I believe that for the world to understand this process, I believe, number 1, the media should report it even more. And number 2, as mentioned in my second solution, I believe that there should be international forums or organizations specifically talking about this problem.
All right, thank you. Thank you. I have Jake now. Thank you, Jake.
Hi, everyone. All right. So, I spent my previous summer conducting research in southwestern Uganda on Lake Bunyonyi, a place which has recently seen the effects of a poorly handled environmental disaster, the COVID-19 pandemic. The disaster that devastated the local population was not caused by the virus itself. Rather, it was the government-mandated lockdown associated with the pandemic that was far more deadly to the people at the lake and in the nearby city of Kabale. The experience of this community at this beautiful lake offers a window into the trials of millions of people around the world who are vulnerable to environmental disasters like pandemics and others driven by climate change, and demonstrates the dangers of ineffective emergency response by governments. At 22 months, Uganda's lockdown was the longest in the world, placing great strain on the homes of one of the world's youngest countries. With students, parents, and extended families suddenly stuck under one roof, there simply wasn't enough food at home and no income or markets from which to buy more. While many people had their own farms, there is no long-term food storage capacity, and time between growing seasons is just too long for food to be constantly available. Families were forced to eat all that they grew before it rotted away, and had few options to turn to when they ran out of food. Facing the threat of beatings from police if they left their homes, many starved. Most of the individuals I spoke to made less than $2 per day before the lockdown, with farmers, in some cases, making only about 25 cents per day. Savings is obviously incredibly challenging in such conditions, and with no ability to work or sell products at the market, some households still have no money for food, school fees, seeds for planting, or starting capital for businesses. And in the estimate of one local clinic, the incidence of underage pregnancies increased from about 1 in 20 to about 1 in 4. Children miss years of school, decreasing their long-term economic outlooks, and many have not gone back. The cascading failures, such as those experienced by the farmers at Lake Bunyonyi, are commonly witnessed by communities in fragile states. And many of these communities will be heavily impacted by the future effects of climate change. They've been left vulnerable without the knowledge, the technology, or the finances that they need to mitigate against the worst that's to come. Their experience is a window into what happens when government-driven policies go wrong, and unfortunately, they very often do go wrong. There's no one approach to fixing this issue, which is why the most critical challenge that we face in the next 5 years is figuring out how to radically reframe and reform our approach toward adaptation before the worst human security impacts of climate change manifest. Decades of action and hundreds of billions of dollars have been spent to mitigate against the effects of climate change, and yet all this money and all these people haven't yet been able to solve the problem. We need to immediately begin to rethink the way in which we allocate our resources so that we can come up with solutions that quickly address the drivers of future insecurity. Evidence shows that most climate financing has actually been spent on reducing carbon emissions, yet emissions continue to increase. And we continue to fail to reduce, as we continue to fail to reduce emissions substantially and quickly, we are worsening the future effects of climate change for the people who are not getting those funds or the support that they need to face it. International organizations, national governments, NGOs, activist organizations have continued to push the same narratives and the same practices for decades, and to no avail. Just like the response to the coronavirus in Uganda, we have bungled the response to climate change. And yet we are doubling down on the same old solutions, like increasing the length of the lockdown instead of finding more practical ways to cope with the threat. Rather than throwing more money and people at the problem, we need to radically upgrade the approach that we have to the threat, and fast. We no longer have the luxury of continuing to follow the same playbook. We must look outside the box or even throw out the box altogether. The definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. We've already spent vast sums of money and engaged enormous numbers of people, but the approach hasn't worked. Instead of managing whatever disaster lies immediately in front of us, we have to plan to effectively combat future insecurity by attacking its root causes directly. We have to stop being so reactive and running from fire to fire. Instead, we have to put in the work to build a world that's a little less flammable. We need to find better ways to use the money pledged to the UN's $100 billion climate fund by encouraging rapid innovation in the climate adaptation and mitigation space. So again, the most critical challenge that we face in the next 5 years is figuring out how to radically reframe and reform our approach toward adaptation before the worst human security impacts of the climate crisis manifest. Through quick, coordinated action, we can improve resiliency, incentivize a greater pace of technological innovation and its application to serious problems, and build capacity to weather environmental and economic shocks at the local, state, and international levels. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Gary?
Yeah, Jake, thanks very much, and thanks for bringing human security into the fray. A straightforward question. You talked about radical upgrades and rapid innovation. If you were briefing the head of the United Nations operating in Uganda, what would you tell her?
Very good question. I think I would come at it from two approaches. So if I were to have the ability to be in that position, I think that I would try to create two different groups. One group working in sort of a like a startup innovation kind of hub that is made up primarily of people from that region or from different regions throughout Uganda, that are then working with maybe some people that are specialized in significant technologies that have been proven to be effective in other areas of the world for adaptation, on coming up with like more radical ways, or more interesting ways, more useful ways to implement those technologies in Uganda to make change. And then the second group, I would ask to, I would have essentially a second group of people being trained in a way that they could go out into the communities and work with individual communities in order to help them begin that adaptation process. A lot of people don't know. A lot of people don't have access, to the information, to the technology, the knowledge about climate change and what's to come. And so I think that if we can send people even to 10 or 20% of communities, other communities will take note of the changes that people are making, and as things get worse, they'll start to make those same changes too.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. We're more than halfway. We have 3 more. Matura, thank you.
Hello everyone, it's great to be with you all here this evening. Our house is on fire. I want you to act as if our house is on fire. Greta Thunberg's words rang out at the World Economic Forum in Davos, framing a global and at times technical issue of climate change as one which is personal, relatable, and inherently linked to our security. But how should we act to protect our house? The next 5 years are decisive. Humanity has the opportunity to limit global temperature rise, protect biodiversity, and hasten the transition to just net zero economies. For this to happen, behavioural and structural change is needed. Strategic communications for environmental change, informed by behavioural science, must be the most important environmental security issue of the next 5 years, if we are to enable the changes that are needed at all levels. It offers a low-cost opportunity to encourage citizens to become active agents for change in their own communities, and for policymakers, businesses, and civil society organisations to enhance existing legal and economic policy tools. And currently, we're not getting that communication right. So let's understand why that is, why it's important, and what we can do about it. And let's start by giving communications for behavioural change a go. As a thought experiment, I'd like you all to spend a couple of seconds imagining yourself in one of 2 scenarios. Either you're trying to persuade your neighbour to purchase sustainable forestry products, or you're an NGO trying to persuade the Portuguese government to carry out environmental due diligence on lithium mining. Spend a couple of seconds thinking about the communications you would use. Now, how did you approach this? Did you focus on communicating the underlying why, or did you focus on explaining how and how to act? Some focus on the harm to our carbon sinks, or values of equality or injustice. Behavioural science tells us that shaping values and raising awareness isn't enough. And this is because influencing human behaviour is really hard. We're complicated, unpredictable beings driven by varied internal and external factors. And for too long, policymaking has relied on the assumption from linear rational choice theory that belief shapes action. We know the catastrophic impact of climate change and environmental degradation on our security. 140 countries have announced or are considering net zero targets. Global population majorities are concerned about the threat and are willing to take action. And yet, there is an enormous gap between what we know needs to happen and what is currently being done. The current contributions from countries towards the targets and the policy measures in place for the future fail us in our critical mission. Nature is declining at a rate unprecedented in our history, competition for Earth's resources is driving conflict, and we're on a highway to hell with excess of 1.5 degrees of warming. Automatic, unconscious mental biases and shortcuts result in a gap between our values and our actions. For example, 72% of European consumers cite the intention to buy sustainable products, and yet this only translates into about 17% making such purchases. Have you ever noticed the impact on your choices from a default option on a form, or the messenger of information, or the social context in which you're making a decision? This value-action gap limits pro-environmental behaviour. Now, why is this the most important issue of the next 5 years? Underlining progress on every environmental security issue you'll hear about tonight is the need to enable behaviour change, whether that's on permafrost or cooperation around lithium. Integrating strategic communications and behavioural science into policymaking, campaigning, merchandising, design is the foundation from which any change can be built and can be long-lasting. And how do we do this? Populist politicians understand effective, data-driven communications for change, and so must we. Just look at the Vote Leave campaign or the step-by-step TikTok guide to keep Matt Hancock in the jungle. Let's use some of their practices. We need to explain what action to take and how to take it. We need to make things easy. We need citizens to participate in designing communications. We need data-driven targeting of audiences, curated choices to nudge, and ideas for individual action based on human stories of success, alongside intelligently applied public and private investment. And global collaboration, keeping things simple and jargon-free. DEFRA's audience segmentation model and Canada's Idle Free Zone campaign are both really good examples to have a look at this in action. If we can get our communications right, we can mobilise pro-environmental behaviour change, enabling collective agency, so we can not only see the fire in our home, but we act to put it out. Thank you.
Anybody wants to ask a question? Yeah, please.
Really glad you brought in communication. Really important. But when you're communicating for impact, you have to select your target audience. Which do you think is the key audience you'd target?
That's a very good question.
I know.
I think the key thing for me is targeting policymakers, for them to integrate behavioural science and communication at every stage of policymaking. Obviously, communications doesn't just exist in a vacuum. It has to exist alongside legal and economic tools for change. And if policymakers realise the importance of communications and behavioural change at really early stages, they bring in communities and citizens in the design process of that policymaking. They encourage communities to be leading communication methods themselves, actually that takes what is quite a kind of systemic approach, and it means it has an impact later down the line on individual behaviour making and behavioural choices. So I think that if I want any audience in the room to pay attention to why strategic communications and behavioural science important as policymakers, but I hope that you'll see from some of the activities that I put in the presentation, some of the techniques I used, that we can all do that within our everyday, within our communications to our family and friends, or even just asking people to participate in something like I asked with a thought experiment. So yeah, I would say policymakers, but let's not all shy away from doing it.
Targeting leadership.
Sorry, yeah,
Targeting
it starts with leadership, but it has to come at both ends. It has to be not just top down, but bottom up. So it's connecting policymakers to all of us as well. Thank you.
Dan, just hold on a minute. AV, the projector is not working anymore. Oh, are they? Okay, cool. So, sorry. Please. Minor technical thing, but we can look at the side.
So do I press this to start? Is it still all good?
Yeah, there you are. So it's coming back. Sorry.
Cool.
Thank you.
Thank you. So the world faces a severe undersupply of critical minerals, which is set to worsen with the green transition. The largest immediate threats to environmental security will emerge if states choose to remedy this by mining for more materials. This is especially true if mining is undertaken in those ecologically vulnerable and politically unstable regions of Africa, where conflict and migration impacts are likely to be large and are liable to spill over globally. Europe, specifically the EU member states and the UK, epitomise the situation. Highly dependent on critical mineral imports, they are currently mobilising resources to secure supplies. If that mobilisation extends mining operations in Africa, it will consign both continents to a less stable future, but it will also sacrifice the opportunity to produce a sustainable solution to what is a global problem. Instead, the EU and the UK must act now to ensure that future is a more sustainable one by securing a circular economy for critical minerals. This decision needs to set an example for the global community and avoid further degradation of Africa. So today's critical minerals are rare, naturally occurring elements which are mined from the ground. They're vital to various functions. Rare earth elements used extensively in the electromagnets used for wind turbines. Cobalt and lithium are used in the production of batteries for electric vehicles. And titanium is essential for military aerospace applications. Demand for all of these materials is expected to outstrip supply with the green transition. Global supply is dominated by China, which either internally produces or produces via the Belt and Road Initiative 66% of the world's critical minerals. This monopoly extends itself to Europe at 44% of total supply. In a moment. Shall I carry on? Or? Okay, cool. In contrast, EU member states only produce 15% of their own minerals, and the UK produces 3%. The European nations recognise the danger. The green transition and conditions for military parity depend disproportionately on one external supplier. To remedy this, they intend to develop new mines in Africa. But acquiring these concessions will damage Africa itself. Development of mines requires large forest and jungle clearances, which will lead to undermining of biodiversity by destroying natural wildlife habitats. Mineral extractions lead to large amounts of chemical runoffs, which are likely to threaten some of the most fertile soil on Earth. As African food security is highly dependent, as African food supplies are highly dependent on local ecosystems, this is likely to undermine African food security with extensive mining. Moreover, resource conflicts may escalate over rights to concessions, with subnational terrorist groups emerging to seize mines as profit centres. There will be wider impacts. Without migration may occur. Sorry, I'm not quite sure what's going on here. Outward migration may occur as food security is undermined and conflict intensifies. This will lead to inter-African and international displacements, leading to exacerbated regional tensions, but also further threats of refugee movements through Europe. As conflict intensifies within Africa, grievances are likely to lead to terroristic action against the EU and UK, which is sparked by this neo-colonialist scramble for resources. Yet there is another path that Europe must choose to follow, a path which can spare Africa's ecology and security and minimise international instability. The EU and the UK, point this way, should invest to reclaim, retain and reintegrate their minerals. Developing recycling capacity would allow Europe to reclaim those minerals already existing within vital technologies. At the moment, many of these are simply scrapped, but development of recycling centres and more efficient methods of recycling would, in effect, produce a native supply for Europe. This would avoid perhaps the most pressing problem inherent of mining expansions, which is the destabilisation of Africa, by avoiding mining in Africa altogether. This native supply will ensure that once minerals are imported into Europe, they'll remain there, creating a circular economy for them. This will reduce reliance on imports and limit China's use of their monopoly to exert geopolitical influence. This will also produce a new industry with new jobs and a renewed sense of European innovation and collaboration. These minerals can then be reintegrated to supply those initiatives high on the UK-EU agenda: renewable development, electrical vehicle production, and military advancements. In doing so, Europe can build a green energy transition on sustainable and dependable foundations. It can choose to emerge as an exemplary leader rather than an opportunistic plunderer of African resources. This decision to mobilise European resources is being undertaken now. Over the next 5 years, that decision will set the stage for the foreseeable future. Europe needs to act now to ensure that future is a more sustainable, peaceful, and equitable one. Europe must decide to reclaim, retain, and reintegrate its minerals, not to extract more. Thank you.
Anybody has a question? I have a question. What do you think is the single major issue that can get Europe to move into reclaim, retain, and reintegrate?
I think, thank you. I think it's already occurred. The issue has already occurred. There's a recognition that working within the African sphere is incredibly difficult. You're balancing all of these different interests, and you're attempting to win out with your own. I think Europe recognises this, but it also recognises the severity of the situation. They're currently mobilising these resources. I think it's 300 million euros through the European Gateway project to ensure they can get the supply. I think what would really motivate it is looking at their options, recognising that these options are, for the moment, very unstable. Looking at Africa, or trying to take these materials from Africa, is not only returning to a history which we'd probably rather forget, it's also essentially not going to work. And I think the important aspect is that Europe needs to recognise this, recognise its strengths as well in innovation and what it can already do, and learn from what it can already do to bring that expertise to the fore and really double down on it. All of that 300 billion euros probably needs to go into just this.
Thank you, Dan. And
thank you.
Great adaptation for the technology.
Yeah, I do apologise for that.
Great one. Last but not least, Claire.
So I argue that the biggest environmental security threat in the next 5 years are zoonotic diseases for their large-scale impact on both humans and the planet. So currently 75% of all emerging infectious diseases are of zoonotic origin, and this is set to rise each year as humans increasingly place more and more stress on animal habitats through unsustainable practices like deforestation and illegal wildlife trade. What makes zoonosis so difficult to fight is that there's no natural immunity for these kinds of diseases among people, which allowed COVID-19 to spread as widely and quickly as it originally did. And other examples of zoonotic diseases are HIV, Ebola, SARS, and MERS, and the list just goes on. So the notable dip in GDP caused by COVID-19, which was actually the sharpest decline in GDP since the Depression, has not only led to the usage of unsustainable options like burning fossil fuels, but also to many socio-economic issues, which then this has further fueled climate change. And zoonotic outbreaks are occurring frequently, like there's currently a new outbreak of Ebola going on in Uganda. And it's only a matter of time when one of these outbreaks spreads more globally, causing another global pandemic. And this makes preparing for these types of diseases early crucial. So even after all the chaos that COVID-19 caused, there is still not enough understanding and research for zoonotic diseases, which then increases the risk of another global pandemic even further. And the world simply cannot afford this for its effects on not just global health, but also the harm it causes to the planet directly and indirectly. So here we can see the economic costs of the pandemic. The University of Cambridge has estimated that COVID-19 will have cost the world about $82 trillion by 2024. And these costs are really hard to calculate, as we still don't know the full cost of the pandemic on, for example, mental health, all the effects of long COVID, and how online teaching will have affected education and future generations. But to put it to perspective, the World Bank has estimated that to end global climate change in the next 10 years would cost around $90 trillion. So the pandemic cost the world around the same amount of money in 5 years as it would cost to end climate change in 10 years. And there are so many more hidden costs of the pandemic that we will be paying for years to come, while still suffering with accelerating climate change and its effects. So even if zoonotic diseases wouldn't be causing the most visible harm globally in the next 5 years, the risk of another global pandemic increases each year if action is not taken to prevent zoonotic diseases from spilling over into humans in the near future. And then we will be paying the costs in the next decade. So here I have gathered the 4 U's that demonstrate the severity of the threat that zoonotic diseases pose. First, we have unpredictability. So we don't know exactly when and where a new outbreak is going to start. Scientists have guessed that a new outbreak could be another coronavirus or something different and more serious this time, like a Nipah virus that originates from camels or swine flu that originates from pigs. Zoonotic diseases can also cause many different types of illnesses, from very mild symptoms to even death, increasing further the uncertainty these diseases pose. And next we have inequality. So COVID-19 pushed 120 million people into extreme poverty alongside a global recession. And this strengthened the divide between richer and poorer nations even further. And the pandemic also aggravated pre-existing inequalities inside nations as job and income losses hit lower skilled and uneducated workers the hardest. Upscale. As I mentioned previously, the costs of the pandemic were severe, and not just to global health, but also to the economy and the planet. And we don't have the money and resources for another outbreak as expensive as COVID-19 was. And lastly, we have unrelenting. It is too late now to prevent another pandemic completely. If a new outbreak were to be MERS, which is a coronavirus far deadlier than COVID-19 was, means that it would cause even more deaths and despair than the previous global pandemic did. So we need to minimize the harm humans are causing to biodiversity and on animal habitats and be well prepared for another pandemic. And now the next 5 years are the most crucial ones to take action, as COVID-19 and the harm it caused is still fresh in people's minds, so people are willing to take action while this is still a priority. Thank you.
Question? No? Please.
So you said, one of the things you said, I heard you say need for research, but I wasn't sure whether you were talking about research into the sources of the diseases, or given that the transfer is inevitable, as you said on the last slide, research into how to respond better to the inevitable.
So
Which would you prioritise?
So I will prioritize research into animals and also people who work with animals. As I was doing research for this presentation, I found out that there's currently not much research still into animals and how they cause infectious diseases. It mainly focuses on humans. And this has been criticized widely because we saw what happened with COVID-19. But also at the same time, I think it's important to also research the other things. So yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Brilliant. What amazing presentations. I think one more round of applause for everybody. was fantastic. I think there's two firsts for Chatham House tonight. One is the student presentations, which I hope we do again. I think it's been really successful. The second is we're actually ahead of time, which is actually quite remarkable, having worked here for 3 years. So we will actually, we were going to give the judges 10 minutes to deliberate, but let's say 15. We'll come back at 6:45 for a final decision. In the meantime, I'll ask the judges to follow Anna to the Astor room, and then everyone else, please feel free to talk amongst yourselves, talk about what you've just heard, and yeah, if we can move the slides up, feel free to take selfies in front of the stage. Thank you.
Within the next decade, climate change will increasingly disrupt our lives. Climate hazards such as droughts, flooding, and wildfires will strike us harder and more often. The impacts these hazards have and our ability to deal with those impacts will depend on the resilience or vulnerability of our societies. Let's compare how climate risks may affect the most resilient and most vulnerable countries. In wealthy countries, including European nations, a drought may be easily managed, avoiding lasting impacts on local agriculture and food supplies. Highly developed water supply infrastructure and irrigation systems make it easy to compensate for low rainfall. When drought strikes, any impacts richer countries do suffer are likely to be contained within the region. By contrast, many less developed countries, particularly those in East Africa and the Sahel, are more vulnerable to drought. Most people rely on agriculture for their food and livelihood, yet only around 5% of cropland across Africa is irrigated, far below the global average of 21%. When drought strikes vulnerable regions, crops fail, food supplies suffer, and poverty increases. More and more people are unable to cope, putting further strain on resources, so less support can be given to help people adapt. Vulnerable communities become more vulnerable, creating a vicious cycle. These devastating impacts don't only affect the vulnerable countries first hit. Climate impacts can cascade across nations and borders, creating conditions for conflict, disrupting international trade and financial markets, and forcing people from their homes. A country or region badly affected by drought cannot export food as usual. Less food is available to trading partners, prices spiral, and hunger and social unrest increase. Protests and riots over food prices can quickly escalate into political instability, destabilizing governments and potentially fueling regional conflict. Now, the impacts are compounding and cascading. Regional instability and food insecurity grow with reliance on imported food from global markets. People in vulnerable countries are compelled to leave their homes, migrating within and across borders, and sometimes crossing continents. The countries to which vulnerable people travel, in turn, face simultaneous impacts from the effects of climate change on countries beyond their borders. The duty to ensure the welfare of climate migrants, and higher demand for resources and food price inflation, which affect both citizens and new arrivals. The cascading impacts of climate change are difficult to predict, but the vulnerabilities that can start such as chains of effects are already a daily reality for many people. To limit the damage of accelerating climate change, we must start by strengthening the resilience of the most vulnerable. 3 actions are key. 1. Prioritize global adaptation and increase climate finance to strengthen the most vulnerable regions. This is in the interest of richer nations, not just to avert regional climate disasters, but to prevent cascading global impacts of food insecurity, migration, and conflict. 2. Produce a comprehensive and up-to-date climate risk register. By better monitoring risk and vulnerabilities, governments, civil society, and the private sector can work together to target and improve resilience and adaptation and lessen climate impacts. 3. Pledge more ambitious nationally determined contribution, NDCs, and sector initiatives to reduce emissions in the very near term. Without ambitious action to halt climate change, the impacts will soon go beyond what any nation can withstand or adapt to. These actions can help ensure societies around the world are better prepared to cope with accelerating climate risks as we approach 2030. Within the next decade, climate change will increasingly disrupt our lives. Climate hazards such as droughts, flooding, and wildfires will strike us harder and more often. The impacts these hazards have and our ability to deal with those impacts will depend on the resilience or vulnerability of our societies. Let's compare how climate risks may affect the most resilient and most vulnerable countries. In wealthy countries, including European nations, a drought may be easily managed, avoiding lasting impacts on local agriculture and food supplies. Highly developed water supply infrastructure and irrigation systems make it easy to compensate for low rainfall. When drought strikes, any impacts richer countries do suffer are likely to be contained within the region. By contrast, many less developed countries, particularly those in East Africa and the Sahel, are more vulnerable to drought. Most people rely on agriculture for their food and livelihood, yet only around 5% of cropland across Africa is irrigated, far below the global average of 21%. When drought strikes vulnerable regions, crops fail, food supplies suffer, and poverty increases. More and more people are unable to cope, putting further strain on resources, so less support can be given to help people adapt. Vulnerable communities become more vulnerable, creating a vicious cycle. These devastating impacts don't only affect the vulnerable countries first hit. Climate impacts can cascade across nations and borders, creating conditions for conflict, disrupting international trade and financial markets, and forcing people from their homes. A country or region badly affected by drought cannot export food as usual. Less food is available to trading partners, prices spiral, and hunger and social unrest increase. Protests and riots over food prices can quickly escalate into political instability, destabilizing governments and potentially fueling regional conflict. Now, the impacts are compounding and cascading. Regional instability and food insecurity grow with reliance on imported food from global markets. People in vulnerable countries are compelled to leave their homes, migrating within and across borders, and sometimes crossing continents. The countries to which vulnerable people travel, in turn, face simultaneous impacts from the effects of climate change on countries beyond their borders. The duty to ensure the welfare of climate migrants, and higher demand for resources and food price inflation, which affect both citizens and new arrivals. The cascading impacts of climate change are difficult to predict, but the vulnerabilities that can start such as chains of effects are already a daily reality for many people. To limit the damage of accelerating climate change, we must start by strengthening the resilience of the most vulnerable. 3 actions are key. 1. Prioritize global adaptation and increase climate finance to strengthen the most vulnerable regions. This is in the interest of richer nations, not just to avert regional climate disasters, but to prevent cascading global impacts of food insecurity, migration, and conflict. 2. Produce a comprehensive and up-to-date climate risk register. By better monitoring risk and vulnerabilities, governments, civil society, and the private sector can work together to target and improve resilience and adaptation and lessen climate impacts. 3. Pledge more ambitious nationally determined contribution, NDCs, and sector initiatives to reduce emissions in the very near term. Without ambitious action to halt climate change, the impacts will soon go beyond what any nation can withstand or adapt to. These actions can help ensure societies around the world are better prepared to cope with accelerating climate risks as we approach 2030.
Can you hear me? All right. Before we announce the winner, I just wanted to invite the panel judge to sort of share their thoughts, because we actually had a really, really productive conversation. And I'll start with David. And just a very quick, you guys can go up there or sit here, however you want to do it.
Do you want them up there?
I mean, what really impressed me was the diversity of the topics. There were some genuine surprises in there, things I wasn't expecting to hear about. So that, and the quality of the argument. I mean, doing a presentation in 5 minutes to time, or almost a time, is a really, really difficult thing to do. People, even senior people, almost never do it, even with lots of practice. So that was really good. And the thought-provoking stuff, I've made loads of notes. Lots of notes about things I want to take back from today. So I'm really glad I came. I'm really glad you made your contributions.
Awesome. Amida or Gary?
Just something that really struck me, I think about two things that you all did, is stating the bottom line up front, especially when you're speaking to policymakers or anyone who has very little time within Chatham House or outside of it, is kind of coming in with that, this is the issue, this is why you need to care, this is what you can do about it. And I thought the comm skills in that regard were excellent and made it very easy to kind of follow your arguments through. So well done on that.
You're right about inviting them being there. Sorry, just should we invite all the participants just to be there so that we can all look at you and then just... Right, Maddie. Sorry, I didn't think it through properly. And also you guys can take photo ops, right? This is the moment for that. Oh, you've done that? Okay. So you know that this is where like John Kerry, the Queen, David Attenborough, they all have pictures there. So, Gary?
And I'm going to join you guys.
Oh, awesome.
Don't worry. But there will be a number of comments coming from the panel of judges. I overheard them and I was part of the decision-making process. About these fine young people. But I'd like to use the few seconds that I have to thank all of you for coming tonight. I've been in the UN for 35 years. I've been all over on the ground, and the issue of climate change and security is the number one issue that I've had to deal with. And you see many, many manifestations of it, and some of it is catastrophic, and it brings tears to your heart. So, if you have decided to come here tonight, it is because you believe also that this is a very important issue. And as you go away and you wend your way forward in your lives, please, just from my perspective, if you can keep that in mind and let it touch the way you touch other people in your work, in your lives, that would be really important. Thank you for coming. You guys too.
Sorry, we'll do all the claps later. Maddie, Madeleine.
Well, congratulations. I mean, just to echo Gary's sentiment about the number one issue, of course we all know it is, and even if I sit here representing the British Army and Defence, you know, it's also highly recognised in Defence that this is the number one issue, and in fact it's what drives the competition for resources because it causes insecurity and conflict. So it's a very acute and challenging problem that we in the military try to understand every day. And in fact, I feel enormously educated tonight, so thank you for your care, your passion, the content, and also your solutions. I'll be certainly taking those back and thinking, driving conversations about that. I mean, I really noticed a common theme for the need for action, but also highlighting the complexity of that action, especially around the change required. And I love the strategic communications piece. And how do you change mindset, behaviours and culture? Because that's actually what we're trying to do here on a global scale. So thank you very much and well done.
Thank you.
A few comments first. You're not alone in this subject. NATO is just setting up a Climate and Security Centre of Excellence in Canada, which is due to start early next year. And if you really want to understand what's going on, that will be where NATO is putting all of their eggs into the basket of what's called CASCO. Not quite set up yet, but will be. And that's because NATO are taking this extremely seriously. Now, that's just one organisation, and it's a military organisation, but it is something that I think is now beginning to really, if you like, hit the highlights. And the other thing that's just in the process of being set up, in fact, next week, is the inaugural meeting, is an all-party parliamentary group on climate and security. Not climate, there's one of those already. Not the environment, there's one of those already, but climate and security. And what surprised us, we're setting it up, what surprised us is the number of people, including people like Caroline Lucas, who are really keen to become part of that, because they are recognising in a way that Parliament hasn't yet really recognised, if I'm honest, that climate and security and our national security is under threat from climate change. And you have brought that to life in different ways in a fantastic set of presentations. So a huge thank you. What I really liked, so I've been sort of near the top of defence for 6 years, so a big government department is backing up your thoughts and your ideas and your propositions with a few facts. And whether it was a case history at Lake Bonyonyo in Uganda, or whether it was facts about what, the percentage of lithium that's being mined from X, Y, and Z, or whatever it was, doesn't matter. The facts were really, really important. And if you can construct an argument that is hanging on a few facts, you can't put too many in. If you put too many facts, people get bored. But actually, hang it on a few facts which really ring home, then it really works. So, and I think you all did that, so a huge thank you.
All right, thank you. So, the moment of truth, right? But before, just to say thank you everyone for coming. This was an experiment that Richard and I came up with the idea a couple of months ago. And thank you for joining with such enthusiasm, and also for all the panels of judges. I mean, you guys are just, you have Lieutenant General, Lieutenant Colonel, and me. Just sorry, I'm probably, in terms of rank, probably the least important here. But the point is, thank you also for being here, for joining us on this, and hopefully, we'll do more of this next year. I'm going to go there, just to say, so it took us obviously more than 15 minutes. Sorry, you guys need to move that a little bit over there. And it took us a little bit more than 15 minutes. There was a lot of debate, pros and cons, strengths, and we ended up with one person. So the reason why we picked up the person was, I'm going to use they, because we are now, they were able to make a really, really strong connection and work at the intersection of issues between policy and supply chain. And they are also able to tie the environmental issue very strongly with a security angle. And I think the most important thing was that they came up with a very clear solution. And so even if the theme wasn't that novel, as in, we talk about it all the time, but the angle that the person went in, and then also how they came in terms of solution was sort of ended up being the winner. So the winner is Dan Burge. And also round to all the participants. Do you guys want to go up and take a picture?
Who's going to take a picture?
Henry can take a picture. Thank you. We'll just do one quick photo up. Yeah?
Are you going to come up as well?
Richard, you should come up. Henry should come up too.
It's going to be a wide-angle lens.
Or we can just huddle. Yeah. You need to show your uniform.
I'm going to do that at this.
Does that fit?
About 3, 2, 1. There we go. I'll take a few. Amazing.
Should I come down so that you can take one? Are you sure? No, I'll do it. He did all the hard work. Sorry, thank you for your patience, everybody. All right.
He's got to get in.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, thank you, everyone.